Hey guys, tonight we're pulling up a splintery stool beside a smoky hearth as you prepare to dine in a dim, drafty hall somewhere in the 14th century. The air smells faintly of old onions, wet wool, and something mushy. A hunched cook is stirring a pot with what may or may not be a fence post. Someone behind you sneezes into the communal bread loaf, and that's your appetizer. You're about to discover why food sucked in medieval times, and not just for the poor. Whether you're a peasant gnawing yesterday's porridge, or a nobleman chasing gilded peacocks across your banquet table, tonight's journey will gently unfold the reasons no one ate particularly well. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And feel free to post where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing how far and wide this sleepy little corner reaches. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the edge of a medieval dining scene. It's not the candlelit romance you're imagining. There's no clinking of silver forks, no roast chicken resting on golden platters. There's a wooden bowl filled with something the texture of wet cement. Welcome to the world of medieval mush. Gruel, pottage, broth. These aren't words meant to excite the senses. In medieval Europe, food was utilitarian, meant to fill the belly, not delight the palate. You lean over your bowl and catch a whiff, earthy, faintly smoky, with hints of boiled root vegetables and regret. The cook assures you it contains leeks and barley, but you're pretty sure something squishy and uninvited made its way in. The truth is, medieval food lacked variety, refrigeration, and, well, joy. Meals revolved around availability, not preference. You didn't say, "What do I want for dinner?" You said, "What hasn't spoiled yet?" You take a hesitant bite. It's warm, slightly grainy, not awful, but not memorable either. Now imagine eating this every day, because you probably would, over and over and over. Most people, especially peasants, ate what was called pottage, a kind of stew made by boiling grains, beans, herbs, maybe an onion if you're lucky, and any scraps of meat left behind. It's endlessly reheated, thickened, and rethinned as needed. Historians even joke that some cauldrons in village kitchens were perpetual, as in, the same stew pot might keep bubbling for days or even weeks. Imagine leftovers that never ended. The wealthy didn't necessarily eat better, they just ate more extravagantly. But even the grandest dishes were often cold, overcooked, or spiced beyond recognition. Their food may have been prettier, but it wasn't necessarily tastier. There's a certain theatricality to noble feasting, but we'll get there. Right now, you're sitting cross-legged on a rough bench, wiping your hands on your tunic and trying not to chew too loudly. As you glance around, you notice something peculiar. No plates, no napkins, no forks. Instead, everyone shares trenchers, thick slices of stale bread used as edible dishes. Once the meal is over, these trenchers are either eaten, given to the poor, or fed to the dogs. Today, you are the poor. You get a soggy piece with a hint of broth, and maybe, if fortune favors you, a stray lentil. You wonder about dessert. Don't. Sugar is a rare luxury, and honey is reserved for the occasional celebration. If anything sweet appears on the table, It's probably dried fruit boiled with wine and dumped over cold barley. Exciting. There's also the issue of cleanliness. You dip your fingers into a bowl of water shared with the entire table. It's cloudy and suspiciously warm. That's your cue to wash up. A child sneezes near the cauldron. No one reacts. What truly strikes you, though, is how dim everything feels. Meals take place indoors, near a hearth, lit by rushlights or tallow candles. Shadows stretch across the walls. You can barely see what you're eating, which, frankly, might be a blessing. To be fair, people didn't complain much. Food was fuel, and most people were too tired from field labor or household chores to demand anything more. As long as it was warm and didn't make you violently ill, it passed the test. Still, historians argue whether medieval people actually enjoyed their meals. Some believe that communal eating was more about ritual and social order than taste. Others point to feast records and surviving cookbooks that suggest at least the aspiration toward pleasure, even if the results fell short. But in your case, sitting here scraping the bottom of a wooden bowl, it's hard to imagine anyone writing poetry about this dinner. A gentle joke floats across the table, someone pretending their stew is as rich as the king's wine. Chuckles follow, quiet and resigned, because even in this gray culinary landscape, people still found ways to poke fun at their own misfortune. A dog wanders in, sniffs your feet, and plops down beside you. His eyes say, "You gonna finish that?" You are, in fact, not. And yet, as your belly warms and the fire crackles low, there's something comforting here, not in the flavor, but in the familiarity, in knowing that tomorrow will bring the same bowl, the same taste, and maybe, just maybe, a turnip. You're still seated at the same rough-hewn table, the smell of wood smoke lingering in your nose. When someone asks if you'd prefer your gruel, thick or thin, it's not a joke. Welcome to the great gruel divide, the social, culinary, and somewhat mushy boundary between classes in the Middle Ages. See, everyone ate gruel or pottage or mush, whatever word you prefer for stuff in a pot. It was a dietary staple across the social ladder. But what went into that pot, that's where things got interesting. Or, well, as interesting as medieval food gets. You glance across the room. At the high table sits a minor noble with a trimmed beard, a fur collar, and, oddly enough, a bowl of something that looks a little more colorful than yours. His gruel has flecks of saffron, maybe a few slivers of dried meat, and even, gasp, a whole onion slice. Scandalous. For peasants, though, gruel was survival food. Oats, water, salt if you had it, a turnip if you were blessed, maybe a handful of nettles or wild herbs plucked from the hedgerow. You stirred it until it thickened, then hoped it would last a few more days. It wasn't meant to taste good. It was meant to stretch. And here's the thing, texture mattered. Peasant gruel was often thick and sticky, something you could eat with your fingers or scoop with bread. Nobles, in contrast, preferred theirs thinner, more soup-like, served in fine bowls you weren't allowed to touch, because nothing says I'm wealthy like watery food and fancy dishware. Now, as you spoon your own clumpy meal into your mouth, someone across the fire tells a joke about a poor man who tried to pass his pottage off as a noble's consommé. Everyone laughs. You fake a chuckle too, though you're not entirely sure what consommé is. Sounds French, dangerous. You're not imagining it. The nobility really did have better ingredients. They added spices, sometimes wine, and even sugar when they could afford it. Their gruel might have chicken stock instead of water, or bits of dried fruit for sweetness. But at the end of the day, it was still hot mush in a bowl, just fancier mush. Historians still argue whether these class differences were as dramatic as they appear in surviving records. Some suggest that the wealthy exaggerated their meals in manuscripts to display power. Others believe peasant gruel was far more nutritious and hearty than noble fare, which could be heavy, unbalanced, and, let's be honest, indigestion-inducing. What's certain is that mealtime wasn't just about eating. It was about knowing your place. Where you sat, what you were served, and how you ate it were all subtle signals of rank. You never looked directly at the Lord while chewing. You never touched the serving bowl unless invited. And you never, ever commented on the flavor, lest it be interpreted as criticism of the cook, of the host, or worse, of God's provisions. You shift slightly on your stool. Someone hands you a piece of yesterday's bread to mop your bowl. It's hard enough to cause dental regret, but you manage. And here's the kicker: during famines, which happened a lot, even gruel wasn't guaranteed. In those lean times, people ground acorns into flour, boiled weeds, or added sawdust to their barley just to bulk things out. You wouldn't call it cooking, more like coaxing something barely edible into being. A whisper from across the table, "Don't eat the red mushrooms." Noted. In some places, people roasted beech bark or boiled straw to make the gruel feel more filling. And if the harvest failed, forget flavor. You were chewing on desperation. Yet, for all its flaws, gruel had its virtues. It was warm, it was cheap, and it was easy to digest. Monasteries and almshouses handed it out to the poor. Mothers fed it to children. Travelers slurped it by roadside fires. It was, in a way, the glue that held medieval food culture together, and also your intestines, depending on the day. You lean back and glance at the ceiling beams above, blackened with decades of soot. The fire pops. Someone to your right frowns at their bowl and mutters, "Tastes like Lent." You're not entirely sure what that means, but it's probably not a compliment. Still, tonight's meal is relatively peaceful. No one's thrown up, no one's passed out, and that one guy with the twitch hasn't started speaking in tongues again. You sip a little water from a cracked mug. It tastes faintly of wood and iron. The good news, you're still upright. The bad news, that might be tomorrow's soup base. What does the future hold? More gruel? Probably. But maybe with a garlic clove if you pray hard enough. You close your eyes for a moment. The world is quiet. The pot bubbles gently. In this moment, with your belly vaguely full and your fingers only slightly burned, you almost feel content. And that's when someone offers seconds. You wake up to the sound of chickens somewhere nearby. Someone's prize rooster is announcing another dim, overcast morning. You stretch, scratch at the straw poking through your tunic, and hope breakfast isn't just gruel again. Spoiler, it is. But before we get to the bowl of sadness, let's talk about where you're eating. Because medieval kitchens weren't quite what you're picturing. No gleaming counters, no pans hanging from hooks like in fancy cooking shows. Instead, think smoke. Think open hearths with no chimneys, just a hole in the roof where soot could half-heartedly escape, if it felt like it. If you're a peasant, your kitchen is the room. The fire is in the center of your one-room cottage, and everything happens around it. Cooking, sleeping, weaving, childbirth, and the occasional goat wrestling. The fire smolders constantly, because reigniting it from scratch each day is a luxury you can't afford. So, there's always a smoky haze in the air. Your lungs complain, but your soup stays warm. Meanwhile, in castles and manors, the kitchens are a separate beast. Quite literally, they're usually separate buildings to keep the heat, stench, and occasional flaming duck away from the main hall. You'll find long-handled pans, enormous cauldrons, and a bustling army of kitchen boys, scullery maids, and slightly disgruntled cooks shouting about eels. So many eels. Historians still argue whether the average medieval kitchen was an ingenious multi-use hearth or a death trap with a thatched roof just waiting to catch fire. The answer is probably yes. You shuffle over to your corner of the cottage and poke yesterday's embers. With a few twigs and a lot of coaxing, the fire groans back to life. A hanging pot swings gently from the iron hook above. It smells fermented, but at least it's not on fire yet. You ladle some thick grey pottage into your bowl. The texture says oatmeal, but the taste says garden floor. You add a dash of dried sage, fancy, and chew slowly, as if that will somehow improve the flavor. Now let's talk tools. If you're lucky, you own a pot. One pot. It's your cauldron, your slow cooker, your deep fryer, and your favorite hat if times get especially tough. Most cooking is done in that pot, hanging from a hook or resting directly in the coals. Frying pans exist, sure, but they're rare and expensive, and everything sticks to them anyway. Knives, you might have one. It's dull. You inherited it. It's mostly used for cutting bread or warding off neighborly pigs. Forks, good luck. Those fancy little pronged devils won't become common for centuries. You eat with a spoon in your hands, and you're proud of it. What's that? You're wondering about cleanliness? Oh, sweet summer child, the kitchen floor is packed dirt. Rats are frequent guests, and insects aren't even guests. They live here. You try to keep things clean, but soap is hard to make and harder to waste. Besides, the cat keeps the worst pests in check. Sort of. The fire crackles, and a neighbor drops by to borrow a pinch of salt. You have none. You both laugh. It's a joke born of hardship, half funny, half hungry. You decide to get creative and add a handful of dried peas to your next meal. Bold move. They've been in the cupboard since last Michaelmas. You boil them for hours, and still they stay as hard as moral philosophy. Eventually, you give up and declare them textural interest. In a nearby manor, by contrast, cooks are stuffing peacocks. That's not a euphemism. They take the meat out, cook it, then stitch it back into the bird's skin and serve it whole, feathers and all. Why? Because medieval dining was also theater, and nothing says power like a roast bird looking you in the eye. Of course, that same feast might feature meat pies full of questionable leftovers, or fish drenched in sauces to mask spoilage, because even with access to more ingredients, preservation was tricky. No fridges, just salt, smoke, vinegar, or plain old denial. You pull your hood over your ears, the wind has picked up, and the kitchen's single shutter keeps banging against the wall. You consider bracing it with a ladle, but then remember you need that for dinner. Let's not forget the cookbooks of the time. Yes, they existed, mostly written by and for the elite. These books included elaborate recipes for things like almond milk, stew, or blanc mange, a blanc-mange-like dish with rice, chicken, and sugar. They read like alchemy manuals: take a capon, slay it under a full moon, boil it thrice, and chant gently. Historians still debate whether these recipes reflect actual daily practice or idealized versions of what nobles wished they ate. The truth is probably a blend. For every roasted swan described in loving detail, there were 10 villagers chewing bark and pretending it was pork. Back in your cottage, you stir the pot again. It's dinner now, and the stew has darkened into something almost hearty. You pull out a lone carrot, your prize, and share it with the neighbor who lent you their last cabbage leaf. Communal meals, even in poverty, carry warmth, and no one minds sharing when you're all equally broke. The candle gutter's low, a pot lid clatters. The fire sighs out smoke and sparks. You press your back to the wall and sip one last wooden spoon of soup. It's still mostly water, but there's a hint of time in it. A little miracle. Your stomach isn't quite full, but it's quiet. The kitchen is calm now, except for the gentle snore of the dog under the table. Another day, another meal survived. You wake the next morning to the soft, rhythmic clatter of rain on thatched roof, less of a drizzle and more of a persistent whisper. It's the kind of rain that turns roads to soup and makes bread go sour in a blink. And speaking of bread, that's exactly what you're craving, if only it weren't so incredibly terrible. You shuffle toward the hearth to poke yesterday's loaf. It's rock hard, not in a crusty, artisanal way, more like, I could use this as a self-defense weapon, hard. Welcome to medieval baking, where the bread is either dangerously dense or alarmingly spongy, and always a gamble. Let's get one thing straight. Bread is the cornerstone of your diet. For peasants, it's not a side, it's the main event. It fills your belly when meat is scarce and makes weak broth feel more like a meal. But oh, the variety, or rather, the lack of it. If you're poor, you're eating black bread, made with rye or barley or whatever grain didn't get eaten by birds, stolen by your neighbor, or rot in the granary. Sometimes it's mixed with pea flour or mashed beans, and occasionally sawdust. Yes, really. Historians still argue whether sawdust was a common famine filler or just an urban legend. Either way, the grit in your molars says plausible. On the flip side, if you're a noble, you get the white stuff, fine, sifted wheat bread, soft enough to tear apart with your delicate fingers. It's baked in special ovens by special people who wear special hats. And no, you can't have any. Go eat your gravel loaf. But even the wealthy didn't always fare better. Ever heard of ergot poisoning? It's caused by a fungus that infects rye. When consumed, it can lead to convulsions, hallucinations, and in some cases death. And guess what? No one could see it coming. One minute you're munching your morning toast. The next you're convinced your cow is speaking Latin. Entire communities suffered from it. In France, they called it Saint Anthony's fire. Sounds holy, was mostly horrible. Your own bread this morning is suspiciously chewy in parts, suspiciously brittle in others. You dunk it in weak ale, the breakfast drink of choice, not because you're partying at 7 a.m., but because water is dicey at best. Most people boiled their water or flavored it with herbs to kill the nasties. But even then, beer and ale were the safer bet. Mild, low-alcohol brews that quenched thirst and masked the taste of despair. If you're lucky enough to own a communal oven, you might schlep your dough across the village and pay the baker a few coins or a chunk of your own bread to use his flames. Otherwise, it's home baking time. That means stone slabs, covered pots, and fingers crossed that the fire doesn't eat it or leave it raw. There's a reason half-baked became an insult. Now, let's talk about trenchers. These are the OG edible plates. Think stale bread sliced thick, used to hold stew or meat at a feast. When the meal's over, you can eat your trencher or give it to the poor. Except by then, it's soaked through, lukewarm, and shaped like disappointment. You break off a chunk of your morning loaf and squint at the strange black bits baked into the crumb. Could be seeds, could be mouse droppings, could be burnt hope. You decide not to investigate further. A little mystery is part of the charm, right? Interestingly, bread was more than food. It was social currency. Your bread said a lot about you, your class, your wealth, your access to mills. Some peasants even had to bake their bread at their lord's mill and pay a tax for the privilege. Want to use your own quern stone at home? That's illegal in some places. Bread control. It's a thing. Even religion got in on the action. Bread was sacred, symbolic, and political. There were strict rules about what kind of bread could be used for communion. And during Lent, bread recipes changed to suit the church's guidelines. Imagine being so pious. You reform your sourdough starter. Back in your cottage, you decide to get creative. You toast the bread over the fire, not for flavor, but to chase off the damp. It catches. You blow on it frantically. Congratulations, you've invented a new charcoal-based diet. Let's not forget the seasonal aspect. Fresh bread was a rare luxury, most of the year. You're eating whatever you managed to preserve. That means hard tack, dry, unsalted biscuits that outlast kingdoms, or bread so stale it needs to be reboiled. Yes, boiled bread. Is it soup? Is it glue? Who can say? Some wealthier households experimented with spices, cardamom, cinnamon, even a hint of sugar if they had trade connections. These were added not just for taste, but to show off. A spiced bread roll on your table was the medieval equivalent of owning a Tesla, with extra raisins. You, meanwhile, sprinkle a bit of salt, precious stuff, on your loaf's edge. It almost helps, almost. And then there's the labor. Baking isn't easy. Grinding flour by hand is exhausting. Kneading the dough with cold fingers while your child tries to chew the cat, also exhausting. Then tending the fire just right, monitoring every crackle like a hawk. If you burn it, that's it. No second chances, no freezer stash. Bread making is high-stakes survival. You step outside to let the smoke clear, rain drizzling down your neck. A neighbor walks by, clutching a flatbread that looks like it's been stepped on. You nod solemnly, bread solidarity. Inside again. The fire's died. The loaf is only half toasted, half charred. You eat around the edges and feed the rest to the dog. Even he hesitates. The candle flickers lower as the wind hums through the shutters. You rest your hands on your belly, not quite full, but not aching either. That counts as victory. And despite everything, you think, maybe tomorrow the bread will rise a little better. Maybe you'll barter for some yeast. Maybe you'll bake it in the coals instead of above them. Or maybe you'll just eat soup again. That's the thing about medieval cooking. It teaches you to be hopeful, one lump of dough at a time. Midday arrives with a gray sky and a gnawing stomach. You've chewed through your breakfast brick, and now it's time for the main meal of the day. That's right. Dinner comes at noon in the medieval world, and supper, much later, is usually a light afterthought unless you're a noble hosting a banquet. But for now, you're focused on this, your attempt at vegetable pottage. You reach into your earthenware pot, hopeful. What greets you is more of a sludge, a tangle of cabbage leaves, onions, a single turnip chunk that's seen better days, and the vague aroma of boiled disappointment. Still, this is the backbone of the medieval diet, the humble, ever recyclable, never quite flavorful pottage. Pottage is not so much a recipe as a lifestyle. It's a thick stew made from whatever you've got, usually root vegetables, leafy greens, stale bread bits, and maybe a bone for flavor if you're lucky. You throw everything in a pot and let it simmer endlessly over the hearth. Some families keep the same pot going for days, adding ingredients as they come. It's like a perpetual stew, or as one modern historian once cheekily described it, a medieval slow cooker without the electricity or the convenience. You ladle a portion into a wooden bowl. It's warm, filling, and shockingly bland. But hey, it's edible, and that counts for something. Salt is scarce and precious. Spices, forget it. Unless you're a merchant or someone high up the feudal food chain, pepper is worth its weight in gold, literally. So most common folk relied on local herbs for seasoning. Parsley, sage, maybe a bit of marjoram or mustard seed. If you're truly daring, you might throw in some wild garlic, but only if you know how to find it and don't confuse it with something poisonous. Your pottage today has nettles. They're nutritious, yes, but also they sting your fingers when harvested. You're proud you remembered to boil them long enough to deactivate the venomous edge. A small triumph. Somewhere outside, a rooster crows defiantly, either confused by the gray light or just showing off. You glance toward the cottage across the field. Your neighbor has chickens. You have envy. Eggs are precious, rich in fat and flavor. Some villagers eat them fresh. Others trade them for bread, milk, or labor. In winter, hens lay fewer eggs. And without fridges, preservation gets creative. Pickled eggs. Anyone? Today's lunch is vegetarian, not by choice, but by availability. Most people in your village go days, weeks without meat. It's a luxury, not a staple. When meat does appear, it's stretched as far as possible. Think gristly broth, skin and bone stew, or salted and dried slices that look like edible shoe leather. The church plays its role in limiting your menu. 2. Over half the year is marked by religious fasting, Lent, Ember Days, Advent, and every Wednesday and Friday. During those times, meat is off limits. Fish is okay, in theory, if you can afford it, which you usually can't. So, fish-shaped bread will have to do. Or, if you are truly sneaky, you might find a plump beaver tail, considered acceptable by some clergy due to its aquatic nature. Historians still argue whether this loophole was widely embraced or more of a theological inside joke. Either way, someone somewhere was happily munching on Lenten beaver. The fire crackles softly as your pottage bubbles low. The scent is earthy, like wet leaves and boiled dreams. You chew slowly, savoring texture more than taste. Cabbage, stringy, onion, surprisingly sweet. Turnip, suspiciously undercooked. But you've had worse, so much worse. Let's not forget food safety, or the utter lack thereof. There's no refrigeration, of course, so people rely on salting, smoking, drying, pickling, and burying food in cool dirt. And even then, spoilage is common. One bad bite and you're racing to the privy, or worse. Not racing at all, botulism, ergotism, salmonella, or the medieval hits. You remember last month when old Thomas from 3 doors down died after eating a suspicious pork pie. Was it the meat, the moldy crust? No one knows. They just buried him with a crust of bread and called it fate. As you eat, you glance toward the firewood pile, running low. You'll need to gather more soon, and not just for warmth. Cooking is wood intensive. Your pottage, like most meals, needs steady heat. No knobs to turn, no timers to beep. Just guesswork, patience, and occasionally tears. Now imagine you're a noble for a second. Meals are extravagant, but not always better. Their kitchens are chaos, huge, smoky, and filled with strange experiments. They eat peacocks and swans stuffed with other birds. Dishes come dyed with saffron or wrapped in gold leaf. Is it delicious? Not always, but it's theatrical, like a food version of a royal joust. You'd just like a clean carrot. Dinner ends with the same ritual each day, scraping the pot, not for cleanliness, but for calories. Every crust of burnt onion counts. You add water to the dregs to stretch tomorrow's batch. Pottage never dies, it just evolves. As you wipe the bowl with a crust of yesterday's bread, you think of the cookbooks of the time. Yes, they existed, but they were written for the elite. Recipes include ingredients like almond milk, rose water, and exotic spices. You squint at your turnip and try to imagine turning it into a dessert. You fail. Still, there's pride in making do, in wringing sustenance from scraps, in turning limp greens into dinner. Your food may not be glamorous, but it's real. It's yours. And for today, it's enough. You place the pot back near the fire, tucking the lid on tight. Outside, rain turns to sleet. Inside, your belly feels vaguely full, vaguely grateful. You settle into your corner of the cottage, sipping from a warm mug of watered ale. Dinner's done, the day moves on, and tomorrow's pottage already waits in the shadows. The afternoon light thins across the thatched rooftops, filtering through your cottage window in a wan drizzle of sun. You stretch, belly mildly full of turnip pottage and yesterday's bread, and consider the next small but crucial dilemma. Where the heck is your protein coming from? Here in your humble medieval hamlet, you're not exactly drowning in grilled meats or fried eggs. In fact, you're barely afloat. The question of protein haunts every season, every meal, and every class. If you're poor, and odds are you are, your options fall into a few meager categories. Legumes, cheese, when lucky, fish, when really lucky, and beans. Lots and lots of beans. You step outside toward the communal garden patch. Rows of fava beans droop like sleepy soldiers, pale pods glistening from last night's rain. These are your lifeline. Fava beans, lentils, and peas were the backbone of peasant nutrition, standing in for meat in both purpose and protein. Sure, they give you gas, but in medieval times, that's the least of your problems. Digestion was mostly seen as an act of divine mystery anyway. One of the local friars once said flatulence was a sign of bodily balance. You've never questioned it since. Back in the kitchen, you begin sorting dried lentils from a cloth sack. They rattle like pebbles, promising at least a half-decent soup later in the week. Lentils are reliable, keep forever, and cook faster than most things, but they're bland unless you can trade for salt or happen upon a spare onion. Protein wasn't just about plants, though sometimes desperate times called for desperate mouthfuls. You've seen folks catch frogs, snails too, even hedgehogs, though getting past the spines is a feat you haven't attempted yet. Hedgehog stew, it exists in more than just rumor. Historians still argue whether these odd meats were everyday peasant fare or occasional famine food. Either way, someone, somewhere, once boiled a hedgehog and thought, this is fine. And then there's dairy, sort of you walk past the neighbor's goats, eyeing them wistfully. Goat's milk means goat cheese, and goat cheese means protein, fat, and flavor. But goats are expensive, fickle, and occasionally possessed by the devil, according to that one sermon last Lent. So if you don't own livestock, you barter. 1 day's labor for a lump of curds. 2 if the cheese is aged. Eggs, when you can get them, are protein-packed miracles. But chickens are vulnerable to foxes, disease, and theft. You remember last winter when someone in the village painted their rooster blue to curse whoever kept stealing their eggs? It didn't work. The rooster just looked confused. You glance toward the woods and consider another protein option. Nuts. Hazelnuts and acorns grow wild, but harvesting them takes time and energy you often don't have. Acorns, in particular, need leaching to remove bitter tannins. It's a multi-day process involving soaking, drying, grinding. You tried once. It ended in a gritty, nut-flavored sadness. For the truly desperate or the morbidly practical, there's always blood. Yes, blood. Not yours, hopefully, but animal blood collected after slaughter, then used in black puddings or thickened soups. It's rich in protein, doesn't spoil immediately, and, according to some monks, tastes better with sage. You shudder at the memory of the time you tried it. You didn't hate it, but you definitely didn't finish your bowl. Let's not forget fish. Technically, fish should be your saving grace, but unless you live near a river or coast, good luck. Fish had to be smoked, salted, or dried to survive transport inland. which made them both expensive and not particularly appetizing. Salted cod was the medieval equivalent of airplane food, necessary, bland, and vaguely untrustworthy. Still, the church said fish was holy, so people complied, at least when anyone was watching. The rich, of course, had no such struggles. In the manor house up the hill, the Lord's kitchen may be roasting suckling pigs or stewing beef with exotic spices. They serve capons, which are castrated roosters bred for fatness, and partridges caught in nets by professional fowlers. They even have carp ponds, a medieval life hack that let them raise fish like farm animals. Must be nice. But their guts weren't always grateful. Over-rich food caused gout, known then as the disease of kings. You imagine some nobleman howling in pain after his fourth pheasant pie, and feel just a little better about your lentil soup. Protein wasn't only about what you ate, it was about how often you could afford to eat at all. Famines were frequent, caused by poor harvests, war, or bad luck. In the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, entire regions starved. Parents abandoned children. People ate tree bark. Some say, well, darker things. But let's keep it sleep-friendly tonight. You tighten your cloak against a sudden gust of wind. Hunger is always close. Even in good years, food was seasonal. You might be full in August, but come February, the pantry's echoing with sadness, which is why preservation was everything. Beans dried, cheese aged, fish salted, and meats, when you could get them, smoked or packed in fat. Tonight, you're lucky. A neighbor gifted you a few leftover cheese curds in exchange for helping repair his fence. They're soft, a bit tangy, and smell faintly of damp straw. You eat slowly, reverently. Every bite feels earned. As the sun sets, you settle near the hearth again. The firelight dances over your drying herbs and the pot you've scraped clean twice. Tomorrow, you'll soak lentils, maybe trade for a few eggs. Perhaps the hedgehog rumor was a joke. But if not, well, protein is protein. You wrap yourself in a wool blanket and listen to the faint rumble of a thunderstorm building on the horizon. A good night to stay in. Dream of roasted chickens and be quietly grateful for beans. Morning breaks with the gentlest drizzle, and you blink awake to the sound of water dripping off the eaves. It's baking day. Well, not for you exactly. You don't have an oven. Almost no peasants do. Instead, you gather your sour-smelling dough, wrap it in a cloth, and head down the lane toward the communal oven, already choked in a smoky haze. Bread is life, not in the poetic, metaphorical sense. Literally, it's your main source of calories. If food in medieval times was bad, it was never worse than when the bread failed, and oh, how often it failed. The oven keeper greets you with a nod. He's already sweating, soot smudging his arms, poking at the glowing coals with a long iron peel. You take your place in the queue and wait, holding your little lump of barley and rye dough close like a warm potato. Around you, others cradle their own offerings, some wrapped in damp linen, others in waxed cloth. The woman behind you mutters about her neighbor's dough rising too fast. It's always drama on baking day. Your dough? It's humble, half barley, half rye, a pinch of salt, a little ale balm for fermentation. Wheat? Don't be ridiculous. Only the church nobility and rich merchants eat refined white bread. For the rest of us, there's maslin, a grain mix often involving rye, oats, or barley. The results are dense, grayish, and astonishingly good at chipping teeth. And still, it's the best part of your day. Your loaf slides into the oven, joining dozens of others, all marked with little slashes or stamped symbols, so no one accidentally takes the wrong one. You've heard stories, entire families eating another's loaf by mistake and starting feuds that last generations. Bread theft isn't just frowned upon, it's a gateway sin, punishable by stocks or worse. As you wait, the smell fills your nose, smoky, earthy, slightly sour. It's oddly comforting. Of all the things that suck about medieval food, at least the bread has personality. You remember a friar once saying, "God gave us bad flour, so we would not grow too proud." You're not proud, but you are hungry. Bread, despite its faults, was everything. It soaked up your soup, formed the base of your cheese pile, and filled in the gaps between lean moments. The average medieval peasant consumed up to 2 pounds of bread a day, and if you couldn't get it, you suffered. Literally. Historians still argue whether famine bread, the kind made with ground-up bark, acorns, or even clay, counted as food or a survival placebo. Some speculate the indigestible versions caused more harm than good, but in a pinch, filling your belly with pine dust beats starving. There's also the question of ergot. Remember your rye loaf? It carries a deadly risk. Ergot is a fungal infection of grains, especially rye, and when consumed, it can trigger hallucinations, seizures, and sometimes death. Entire communities have suffered from outbreaks. You once heard a story, probably exaggerated, about a village dancing until collapse, limbs flailing and eyes wild. They said it was demons. It was probably just bad bread. The oven keeper calls your mark, and you claim your loaf, hot, cracked, dense, and slightly singed on the bottom. You cradle it like a newborn. Is it perfect? No, but it smells like effort and fills you with a kind of primitive hope. Heading home, you notice something interesting. A man near the crossroads selling trencher plates. Essentially, they're stale bread rounds, hollowed slightly in the center to hold stews or pottages. In wealthier households, food is served on these, and then either eaten or given to the poor if the dogs don't get them first. You briefly consider buying one for the novelty. Then remember your coin pouch is as empty as your spice rack. At home, you break your loaf. The crust cracks open, revealing a moist, dense interior. It's chewy, unevenly baked, and wildly inconsistent in flavor. Still, it's food. You tear off a piece, dunk it into leftover turnip broth, and chew slowly, watching the fire pop in the hearth. Some days, bread is all you eat. The rich, as always, live differently. They have fine manchet bread, white sifted flour soft as cake. They slice it with knives of ivory and spread it with imported honey or sugared fruit paste. Their loaves are sculpted into swans or castles, dusted with gold leaf, and baked by professionals who wear clean aprons and never spit on the dough. Still, even the rich fear famine. Bread shortages in the 14th century led to riots, grain hoarding, and accusations of sorcery. The church tried to help. occasionally handing out loaves to the needy. But there were limits. You can't pray your way out of a failed harvest. You glance at the corner of your cottage where a small cloth bag holds next week's grain ration. It's not much, just enough for another loaf, another line at the communal oven, another smoky morning of flour-dusted gossip, but it's something. And so the bread cycle continues, soaking, mixing, rising, waiting, praying, baking, every bite a gamble between nourishment and a bout of food poisoning. You take another bite and smile weakly. Why did food suck in medieval times? Well, some days it was just the bread's fault. You wake the next morning with a strange ache in your side, and for a terrifying second, you wonder if the bread was bad. But no, just a knotted muscle from sleeping on straw. You stretch, yawn, and prepare for another adventure in disappointment. Soup. It's not really soup the way your modern brain imagines it. There's no creamy base, no bubbling pot of hearty stew with buttered biscuits on the side. What you've got is pottage, a vague, perpetual boil of things that used to be food, and it's been sitting in your cauldron for days. You poke at it with a wooden spoon, floating chunks of parsnip, a few lentils, something green that might have once been a leek. A film coats the top, not quite mold, not quite oil. Somewhere beneath the surface is a barley grain you're determined to find. You reheat it over the fire and inhale deeply. It smells warm. That's the nicest thing you can say. Pottage is the backbone of your diet. It's endlessly adaptable. In theory, in reality, you're working with turnips, onions, cabbage cores, and the occasional legume if you've been lucky at the market. Meat, rare, herbs, if they're still growing in the churchyard and no one's looking. Still, this bubbling grey slurry is a lifeline. You eat it for lunch and again for dinner, ladled over yesterday's bread or whatever grain you scrounged. Everyone in town has their own secret recipe. But let's be honest, it's mostly a matter of what didn't rot yet. Historians still argue whether medieval pottage was a dish of desperation or a clever way to stretch resources creatively. Some call it rustic ingenuity. Others say it was like eating flavored rainwater with a side of wood chip. Either way, it was dinner. You sit by the fire and sip from a wooden bowl, slurping politely to cool it. The texture is lumpy. One of the lentils is undercooked, and it clicks like a pebble in your teeth. You chew through the chewable bits and swallow the rest like medicine. Nearby, your neighbor is boiling something even worse, a thick paste of dried peas that looks like green mortar. She calls it peas porridge. You call it sad. It's nutritious, sure, but in the same way tree bark is fibrous. It's hot, it's vaguely filling, and if you eat it fast, your tongue doesn't have time to judge. Sometimes, though, you get lucky. You remember last month when old Matthew's son brought back a hare from the woods. Not legal, of course, poaching's punishable by death. But that night, the village shared a stew so rich it brought people to tears. One woman said she tasted time, real time. You lean back, sipping your bland bowl of survival, and reflect on how rare spice is. Salt, if you're coastal or well-connected, maybe pepper. That's for lords and monks. You once heard a story of a man trading his cow for a sack of peppercorns. He was immediately robbed. You reach for a tiny cloth pouch. your precious seasoning stash. Just a few dried leaves of sage and a single shriveled garlic clove. You consider dropping it into the pot, but hesitate. It's Tuesday. Better to save it for Sunday, celebration day. Garlic deserves a spotlight. Instead, you add a drizzle of yesterday's bacon fat, saved in a horn by the hearth. The flavor deepens slightly. A nearby dog perks its ears and whines. Now and then, you dream of a noble's table, roasted game, stewed fruit, pies so tall they could hide a squirrel. But even they suffer. Their meats are often stale, heavily salted, or covered in strange sauces to hide the rot. One traveler once described a nobleman's feast as a collection of overcooked crimes. Still, they had cooks, they had ovens, they had variety. You've got cabbage water, and then there's fast days. The church mandates dozens of days where meat, dairy, and eggs are forbidden. That's hard when your diet already barely includes them. On those days, your pottage gets even sadder. Oats with water, maybe a splash of ale if you're feeling reckless. You once tried to convince yourself that barley porridge was luxurious. You were very hungry. You finish your bowl and stare at the bottom, wishing it held secrets. A carrot nub, a stray bean, anything, but no, just residue. You scrape it clean with a hunk of crust and gnaw it slowly. Outside, a boy walks past with a string of dried fish. You wonder how much he paid. Fish are tricky. The church encourages them, but catching them is a profession, one you're not part of. And salted herring? Let's just say you once smelled one and decided fasting was fine. You gather your things and step into the cool morning light, still tasting the garlicky broth. It's not good, but it's not poison. That's a win. You pass by a monk tending a garden and ask politely for a wilted onion. He offers you a stare instead. You move on. Later, you'll reuse the pottage water, thicken it with barley gruel, maybe toss in a handful of dried nettles. You'll tell yourself it's different, new, exciting even. You'll believe it just long enough to finish the bowl. Why did food suck in medieval times? Because it never changed. Because even your dreams smell like onions. Because if you tasted a real tomato, it might make you cry. You sigh, wipe your spoon clean with a rag, and hang it back on its hook. Time to go forage for something that tastes like flavor. You wake to the faint crowing of a rooster and the faint glow of dawn stretching across the village rooftops. Today, you've promised yourself you'll try something different. Game. Not the dice kind, but wild animals caught from the forest. It's an elusive luxury. The kind of food that might save you from the perpetual grey taste of pottage and dense bread. Game meat is a tricky business in medieval times. The laws are strict. The forests, though vast, belong to the king or local lords, and hunting without permission is a serious offense. Poaching was common, but it was also dangerous. Capture could mean fines, imprisonment, or worse. Despite this, game was coveted. Venison, wild boar, rabbit, and even pheasant made their way into kitchens of the wealthy and occasionally the lucky peasants who knew a woodsman. The flavor, when fresh and cooked right, was a sharp, rich contrast to the blandness you're used to. You think about the last time you tasted hare. It was a rare celebration, an illicit gift from a traveling hunter. The meat was lean, slightly sweet, and had a gamey edge that tingled on your tongue. You remember how the fat pooled on your plate, how the broth simmered with wild herbs that you couldn't name. It was a taste of freedom. But for most people, game meat was a distant dream. You wonder why the laws were so tight. Maybe it was to preserve the forests, or to keep the peasants from gaining too much independence. Historians still argue whether the strict hunting laws were about conservation or social control. Today, you set out with a makeshift spear, your heart pounding. You're not really a hunter, but desperation breeds courage. The forest smells damp and alive. Birds chatter overhead. You step softly on mossy ground, eyes scanning for movement. Suddenly, a flash of brown. Rabbit, you crouch, aim, and throw your spear. It's a clumsy attempt, and you miss. The rabbit scampers away, disappearing into a thicket. You sigh and continue wandering, thoughts drifting to food preservation. Even if you caught something, how would you keep it? Salting meat is an art form requiring salt, smoke, or cold temperatures. Without those, the meat spoils fast. The rich have smokehouses and cellars, but you have a cool well and a pit dug near the hearth. You once tried smoking fish using dried herbs, but the results were inconsistent, sometimes delicious, sometimes downright hazardous. Then there's the problem of preparation. Cooking game requires skill. You need to remove the bitter parts, marinate the meat to tenderize, and pair it with herbs to mask the strong flavors. Without access to spices or a proper kitchen, you're left with boiled chunks that taste like the forest floor. As you trudge back, empty-handed, you spot a man selling dried venison strips, jerky. It's tough and salty, but it lasts. You barter some coins for a small piece and nibble cautiously. It's salty, chewy, and not quite fresh, but it's a break from bread. You remember a curious story you heard once about medieval jerky. Some people soaked the strips in ale before eating to soften the texture and add flavor. You wonder if you could try that when you get home. Back in the village, the scent of roasting meat drifts from the Lord's manor. The feast they're having is extravagant. Wild boar stuffed with herbs, pheasant roasted over an open flame, pies filled with rabbit and spices you can't name. You imagine the richness of the sauces, the buttery crusts, the wine that accompanies every bite. You recall that even among the elite, game meat could be unpredictable. Sometimes it was tough. Sometimes it had an overpowering flavor. One chronicler described a boar roast so greasy that the guests slipped off their chairs. Still, it was better than what you have. You finish your jerky and head inside, already dreaming of the next attempt. Maybe tomorrow you'll be luckier. The day fades into evening, and you find yourself back by the hearth, pondering the curious world of medieval food preservation, an art born of necessity and sheer stubbornness. You might think that without refrigerators, food would rot in hours, but somehow people managed to stretch meals across days, even weeks, mostly by drying, salting, smoking, and fermenting. All the science of keeping things from turning into inedible mush. Salt, the prized mineral, is the unsung hero here. It was more valuable than gold in many places and used to preserve everything from fish to meat. Without it, your bacon would be a breeding ground for every stomach bug imaginable. You probably already know about the salt routes, long, dusty trails where merchants hauled salt across continents. You can almost hear the clink of the carts and smell the dry, briny air. Yet, salt wasn't cheap, and not everyone had access to it. You, for one, rely on sun-dried herbs and root vegetables that won't spoil easily. But if you had salt, you could cure meat, turn fish into stockfish, or make pickled vegetables that last through winter. Smoking is another ancient trick. And here's a quirky fact. People didn't just use wood. They sometimes smoked foods over piles of herbs, or even dried animal dung, believing it added a certain flavor or had cleansing properties. Historians still argue whether this was about taste, superstition, or both. Imagine your dinner lightly infused with the aroma of smoky pine and, well, something else. Drying foods like peas, beans, and fruits was common. They'd be spread out on racks or tied into bundles, left to bask in the sun and breeze. This method, while simple, could change the texture dramatically. Peas turned into hard nuggets that needed hours of soaking before they softened. One medieval recipe actually advises cooking these dried legumes in ash water to speed the process. You can imagine the gritty aftertaste. Then there's fermentation, a process medieval people mastered without fully understanding microbes. Fermented drinks like mead and ale were common, not just for fun, but because the alcohol helped kill bacteria in drinking water, which was often questionable. Some fermented vegetables, like sauerkraut, kept longer and added much-needed vitamins during winter. You imagine yourself at a humble table, nibbling on dried salted fish rehydrated in broth, paired with sour cabbage that tingles your tongue. The textures are strange, sometimes chewy, sometimes mushy, but they keep you alive. You also recall that medieval people sometimes wrapped food in leaves or cloth soaked in vinegar or wine to delay spoilage. Fancy lords even imported exotic spices like cinnamon and cloves, not just for flavor, but because these spices were believed to purify food and extend freshness. Of course, these spices were so expensive, most peasants wouldn't see them unless handed down as scraps. Your stomach rumbles as you think of all this. Preserved foods are practical, sure, but not always delicious. You remember trying to make your own salted pork once. It was so tough you could barely slice it, and chewing felt like a workout. Still, preservation was vital. Without it, winter would mean hunger or starvation. You glance around your small kitchen area, imagining how different it would be with a salt cellar full of crystals and a smokehouse out back. Instead, you settle for the humble dried peas simmering quietly in your pot. And while you dream of fresh vegetables and sweet fruit, you know you'll be boiling and reheating this same stew for the foreseeable future. The morning light filters weakly through the narrow window of your cramped kitchen, illuminating the simple wooden table cluttered with rough earthenware bowls and a loaf of dense, hard bread. Today's focus drifts to the staple of nearly every medieval meal, bread, and not just any bread, but the kind that seems designed to test your jaw's endurance more than satisfy hunger. Bread was the backbone of medieval diets, yet it often came with a side of frustration. You're likely imagining soft, fluffy loaves. But no, what you get is something closer to a brick. tough enough to break a tooth or two. This was partly because the flour was coarse, full of bran and husks, ground with stone wheels that didn't quite separate the grain perfectly. You try to picture grinding wheat with a heavy stone, dust filling the air, and you're surprised anyone could bake anything edible at all. The social divide showed clearly in bread. The wealthy ate white bread made from finely sifted flour called manchet, a delicate treat reserved for nobility and the very rich. The common folks' bread, brown, rye or barley-based, was dense, gritty, and sometimes sour from natural fermentation. You can almost hear the grumble of peasants biting into their bread, jaws working hard to chew every mouthful. And then there's the crust, often thick and burnt in places, because the ovens were rudimentary and hard to regulate. You imagine the smoky aroma filling the air, mingling with the ever-present scent of burning wood and ashes. The crust was often the best part, ironically, because the inside could be dry or even damp if the loaf wasn't baked properly. Here's a curious medieval tidbit. Stale bread was repurposed in a surprising variety of ways. It might be softened with broth to make pottages or porridge, or soaked in vinegar and oil as a kind of primitive salad called trencher bread. In fact, trenchers were thick slices of bread used as plates, which soaked up all the gravy and juices, no crumb left behind. You think about the irony. The plate becomes part of the meal, eaten by the poor or discarded after. Historians still argue whether bread shortages were primarily due to bad harvests or poor milling techniques. But either way, bread was precious. Sometimes famine made bread out of anything but wheat, acorns, chestnuts, even ground bark. You shudder to imagine the taste. In the cities, bread was also subject to laws. Bakers were regulated to ensure weight and quality, but enforcement was spotty. Bread that was too light or poorly made could lead to riots, which happened more often than you might think. After all, bread was survival. Your teeth ache just thinking about it, but somehow this tough bread fed millions, day in and day out. It was a culinary challenge, but also a comfort, familiar and filling. Tonight, you nibble on your crust, imagining the millstones turning endlessly, the baker's hands kneading dough in dim kitchens, and the smell of bread fresh from the oven. It might be tough, but it's the taste of medieval life itself. You sink into the slow rhythm of the day, the faint crackle of the hearth fire mingling with the soft clink of pottery. Today, your thoughts settle on medieval beverages, because while the food might often disappoint, the drinks offer a curious blend of comfort, oddity, and, occasionally, questionable hygiene. Water in medieval times is notoriously risky. You've probably heard that people rarely drank plain water, thanks to contamination and poor sanitation. Instead, ale and beer were the beverages of choice, consumed from morning till night. Not the strong, bitter lagers you might imagine, but mild, low-alcohol brews that were safer than the local wells and rivers. It's funny to think of workers sipping small beer throughout their shifts, a sort of daily tonic that kept them hydrated without the stomach bugs. The process of brewing was a delicate balance. Barley, malted and dried over fires, became the base. Sometimes herbs or spices were added, think juniper, rosemary, or even meadow sweet to mask flavors or add medicinal qualities. You almost taste the sweet tang of fermented grains as you imagine the bubbling vats in a dark cellar. Then there's mead, the honey wine, a favorite at feasts but far less common for everyday folks. As honey was precious and pricey, mead has a mythical quality, often linked with celebrations, magic, and the gods in old tales. You wonder how it must have felt to sip this golden, sweet drink amidst the roughness of daily life. Wine, too, made its way into medieval cups, mostly in southern Europe or among the wealthy. But its flavor was different back then, often sour, thick, and heavily spiced. Sometimes it was mixed with water or boiled into mulled wine, a warming concoction perfect for cold nights. You chuckle remembering a medieval recipe that calls for adding crushed pearls to wine for health benefits. The idea sounds extravagant and a bit absurd, but that's medieval thinking for you, combining luxury with superstition. Historians still argue whether these drinks were truly safer than water or just a slightly less risky gamble. But one thing is certain, drinking alcohol was part necessity, part social ritual. You also learn that in some places, fermented dairy drinks like buttermilk or kefir-like beverages were common, especially in cooler climates. They were sour and tart, but nourishing and easier to digest than fresh milk, which spoiled quickly. Of course, you think about the flip side. Some medieval beverages were downright bizarre. There are records of herb-infused waters, strange cordials, and even possets, warm drinks made of milk curdled with ale or wine, flavored with spices. You're curious if they tasted better than they sound. As evening falls, you imagine yourself holding a wooden cup filled with warm, spiced ale, the aroma mingling with the smoke from the fire. It's humble, earthy, and oddly comforting, the medieval answer to a modern nightcap. You sip slowly, feeling the warmth spread, grateful for this small pleasure amid the often bland foodscape. You turn your thoughts to the world of medieval spices, those rare, costly treasures that promise to transform the simplest dish into something almost magical, if only you could afford them. Spices were the medieval equivalent of luxury cars or designer clothes, status symbols more than mere flavor enhancers. They added color, scent, and a touch of exotic mystery to meals that otherwise might be dull, bland, or downright unappetizing. Imagine a bustling market where piles of black pepper, cinnamon sticks, cloves, and ginger are displayed like jewels. Merchants shouted in dozens of languages, hawking their wares from distant lands, the silk routes and spice trails that connected Europe to Asia and beyond. These spices traveled thousands of miles, carried by camel caravans, sailing ships, and hardy explorers, accumulating layers of cost and legend along the way. Pepper was king among spices, often used so lavishly in recipes that the result could be overwhelmingly pungent by modern standards. You picture a feast where cooks, trying to impress nobles, sprinkled pepper generously over meat and sauces, not caring if it made diners cough or water their eyes. It was worth it to flaunt wealth and refinement. But there's a quirky fact you might not expect. Medieval cooks sometimes mixed spices with bizarre ingredients like powdered pearls, gold leaf, or crushed coral, believing these mixtures had health benefits or magical properties. Historians still argue whether these extravagant additives actually improved the flavor or were just status displays. Either way, it makes you smile thinking of diners munching on gold-flecked pies. Interestingly, many of these spices had medicinal reputations. Cinnamon was thought to warm the body and prevent colds, while cloves supposedly improved digestion and kept evil spirits at bay, a reminder that food and medicine were closely linked in medieval minds. Spices also masked the unpleasant flavors of preserved or aging meats, which were common due to limited refrigeration. You can almost taste the spicy stew, the sweetness of candied ginger mingling with the saltiness of cured pork. However, for the average person, spices were a distant dream. Most peasants never saw these exotic powders, relying instead on locally grown herbs like parsley, sage, and thyme. These herbs added gentle flavor without emptying the purse. You imagine the contrast vividly, the noble's table glittering with spiced delicacies, the commoner's simple broth flavored with garden herbs. Yet both had their place in the medieval food world. As the fire crackles softly, you ponder how these fragrant spices shaped not only meals, but the whole culture of medieval dining, turning food into a statement of power, health, and sometimes just a bit of fun. You're settling into the twilight hours, and your thoughts drift toward the often overlooked centerpiece of medieval food culture, salt. It's the silent hero behind flavor, preservation, and the occasional source of economic upheaval. Salt wasn't just a seasoning, it was a crucial preservative in a world without refrigeration. You imagine the laborious process of harvesting salt from boiling seawater in shallow pans under the hot sun to mining it from ancient salt deposits deep underground. Salt was so valuable that it was sometimes called white gold, and its trade shaped economies and politics across continents. Medieval households used salt to cure meats and fish, creating staples that could last through harsh winters and long journeys. Without salt, most of the protein supply would spoil rapidly, leading to hunger or worse. You think of the salt-cured herring or bacon hanging from rafters, filling the air with that distinct, slightly briny aroma. But salt wasn't cheap. You probably wouldn't survive long without it. Yet peasants often had to ration it carefully, while the rich sprinkled it freely, flaunting their access. Salt taxes and monopolies could lead to protests and even riots, a salty ingredient in social unrest. Here's an odd bit. In some regions, salt blocks were used as currency or given as payment. You picture a medieval marketplace where a handful of salt could buy a loaf of bread or a chicken, making it a true economic cornerstone. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of salt contributed to certain health issues, like hypertension, but there's little doubt about its importance in keeping food edible. On a lighter note, salt was also used in medieval kitchens to tenderize tough meat, or even to clean dishes, sometimes sprinkled on pots to scour away residue. Long before sponges and detergents existed. You also think about how salt shaped religious and social rituals. Salt was part of blessings, used to symbolize purity and preservation. It was also a marker of hospitality, sometimes offered to guests to demonstrate generosity. As the evening deepens, you feel the subtle crunch of salt lingering on your tongue, a humble but vital reminder of medieval survival. Salt flavored more than food. It flavored entire lives, economies, and even legends. You lean back, the soft glow of embers casting shadows, appreciating this unassuming mineral that, against all odds, kept the medieval table from falling completely silent. The flickering candlelight paints dancing shadows on the cold stone walls as you shift your attention to the medieval dining table's centerpiece. Meat, or rather the peculiar relationship medieval people had with it, both craving and struggling to enjoy it properly. You probably imagine knights feasting on succulent roast boar, or noblemen tearing into thick cuts of beef. But reality was often less appetizing. Meat was a luxury for most, reserved for the wealthy and special occasions. For common folk, it was rare, and when they did eat it, it was often preserved, dried, or salted, altering the taste and texture significantly. Cooking meat was a challenge. Open hearths lacked consistent heat, and recipes were vague at best. Cook until done was the norm. Sometimes meat ended up rubbery, overcooked, or oddly flavored due to preservation techniques. You picture a stew simmering for hours, the aroma thick but the texture uncertain. A quickie fact: some medieval cooks believed meat should be purged before cooking by soaking in water or milk overnight to remove bitterness or blood. This could make it tougher or spoil faster, depending on conditions. Historians still debate how effective or widespread these practices were. Hunting was a popular pastime for nobles, bringing fresh game like deer, boar, and hare to the table, but fresh game meat was often gamier, tougher, and had to be prepared with strong spices or slow cooking to become palatable. Fish, on the other hand, played a significant role due to frequent fasting days imposed by the church. Salted, smoked, or dried fish were common substitutes. You imagine the sharp, salty tang of preserved cod or herring as a regular diet staple. Here's a fun aside. Medieval recipes sometimes called for unusual cuts, like boiled pig's feet or roasted swan, delicacies for the daring diner. Swans were considered royal fare, adding an air of ceremony to meals. Meat was often served with sauces thickened by breadcrumbs, wine, or fruit syrups, flavors that might seem odd to modern palates, but added sweetness or tartness to the dish. The blending of sweet and savory was typical, part of the medieval palate that surprises many today. You ponder the texture of the meat, the smell of smoky smokehouses, and the slow rhythm of chopping and stirring. It wasn't perfect, but it was food. And in the medieval world, that counted for a lot. As you lean back in your chair, the echo of a distant hunt or the crackle of a roasting spit drifts through your mind, a sensory bridge connecting you to those long-gone feasts. You settle into the quiet rhythm of the evening and let your mind wander towards the strange, sometimes unsettling world of medieval food hygiene. The kitchen smells, thick with smoke, spices, and sometimes a faint tang of something less pleasant, fill the air as you picture medieval cooks navigating a very different set of challenges. Unlike the sanitized kitchens of today, medieval food preparation was a dance around many potential hazards. Lack of refrigeration meant meat and dairy had to be consumed quickly, or preserved by salting, smoking, or pickling. You can almost hear the crackling of the hearth as cooks worked tirelessly to keep food from spoiling, often battling flies, rodents, and curious cats prowling the kitchen floor. A quirky tidbit. In some medieval texts, you find advice on boiling meat multiple times to cleanse it of impurities, or even soaking vegetables in vinegar or wine to remove corruption. While this sounds like an early form of food safety, historians still argue whether these practices truly prevented illness or were simply based on superstition. Washing hands before meals wasn't common among the general population, although the wealthy had elaborate rituals involving servants pouring scented water over their hands. Imagine dining while guests discreetly wiped grease and crumbs on their sleeves, far from today's neat napkin etiquette. One challenge was that medieval people often ate with their hands, sometimes sharing bread as an edible utensil or tearing into roasted joints directly. This practice increased the risk of spreading germs, but without a germ theory, few understood the connection. Interestingly, some households used vinegar or sour wine as a mild disinfectant for cutting boards or utensils. The strong smell likely helped mask odors, but its effectiveness against bacteria remains uncertain. You might be amused to learn that in certain regions, cooks recommended rinsing wine cups with urine to clean them, a practice based on the ammonia content of stale urine. It sounds bizarre now, but it was considered practical then. Despite all these quirks, medieval people had a surprisingly good sense of preserving their health through diet and hygiene, at least compared to earlier eras. Monasteries, with their strict rules, often set the standards for cleanliness and food preparation. As the fire crackles softly and the shadows lengthen, you consider how medieval kitchens were both battlegrounds and sanctuaries, places where survival depended on balancing danger with necessity. You take a slow breath, imagining the smoky warmth and quiet clatter, feeling grateful for modern sinks and soap, yet oddly charmed by the resourcefulness of the past. You sink deeper into the evening's calm, and your mind drifts toward one of the stranger corners of medieval dining, the curious case of medieval sweeteners. Sugar, as we know it today, was a precious rarity, and most sweetness came from honey, fruit syrups, or even unexpected sources. Honey was the primary sweetener, harvested carefully from beehives scattered across meadows and forests. You can almost taste its rich floral notes dripping from freshly baked bread or mingling with spiced wine at a feast. Honey wasn't just for flavor, it was also prized for its supposed medicinal qualities, used to soothe sore throats or heal wounds. But honey was expensive and limited, so medieval cooks experimented with alternatives. Fruit syrups made by boiling down grapes, apples, or pears provided a gentle sweetness, sometimes dark and tangy, often mixed into sauces or desserts. Imagine a thick amber glaze brushing over roasted meats or puddings. A quirky fact: monks sometimes made a syrup from birch sap or maple trees, sweet but far less common. Historians still argue how widespread these lesser-known sweeteners were, and whether they made a significant culinary impact. You probably wouldn't want to try the odd concoction called sack posset, a hot medieval drink mixing wine, eggs, and sweetened milk, often flavored with spices. It was believed to cure colds and soothe the stomach, but for many, the taste was a puzzle wrapped in warmth. Sugarcane, grown mostly in warmer climates, was imported in crystalline form but remained a luxury for royalty and wealthy merchants. When used, sugar was often molded into elaborate shapes, like cones or lozenges, serving more as decoration than as a bulk sweetener. This limited access meant that medieval desserts were not what we think of today: rare, often dense, and reliant on what the season and region could provide. Dried fruits like raisins, dates, and figs added bursts of sweetness, and almond pastes or marzipan gave a creamy, sugary texture. You picture a noble's feast where a sugar sculpture sparkles under candlelight, a symbol of wealth and indulgence, while the common folk savored simple honeyed cakes or fruit compotes. As the night deepens, you feel the lingering sweetness on your tongue, a delicate reminder that even when food sucked, there was still room for moments of pleasure and creativity. The night is growing quieter, and your thoughts gently turn to medieval beverages, the unsung heroes and occasional villains of daily life. Water was often unsafe to drink, so medieval people drank a wide variety of other liquids that helped them stay hydrated, sometimes with surprisingly odd results. Ale and beer were daily staples, consumed by almost everyone regardless of age or status. You can almost feel the frothy head of a mild ale brushing against your lips, its grainy, earthy flavor warming your throat. Brewing was a domestic craft, with each village or household boasting its own recipes, often far milder and less alcoholic than modern versions. Wine was another common drink, but mainly in southern Europe, especially among the wealthy. You picture dusty barrels aging in stone cellars, the sweet smell of fermenting grapes lingering in the air. It was often mixed with spices or diluted with water, since drinking straight wine was considered somewhat excessive. A curious medieval beverage was posset, a warm, spiced concoction blending milk, wine or ale, and sometimes eggs. It was thought to aid digestion or soothe colds, but had a texture and taste that modern drinkers might find puzzling. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly preferred these drinks for taste or out of necessity, given the dangers of contaminated water. Some evidence suggests ale and beer had safer water due to boiling during brewing, making them a practical choice. You might smile to learn that even children were given weak ale or beer, and in monasteries, monks brewed beer so mild it barely registered as alcoholic. The emphasis was on nutrition and hydration, not intoxication. Spiced wines, mead, made from fermented honey, and cider also had their places, each region contributing unique flavors depending on local crops and traditions. Mead, in particular, was linked to celebration and ritual, its sweetness echoing the honey's earlier role in medieval kitchens. Even vinegar had a beverage role, diluted into switchel or used as a souring agent in drinks, sometimes mixed with herbs and honey to create early health tonics. You imagine medieval taverns filled with the murmur of conversation, the clink of mugs, and the warm haze of smoke and drink, a social hub as vital as the food on the table. As you listen to the imagined hum of conversation, you feel the timelessness of shared stories and drinks, a comforting ritual across centuries. The flicker of torchlight casts soft shadows as your thoughts settle on the peculiar world of medieval kitchen tools and cooking methods, a place where ingenuity met necessity in often clunky, charming ways. Imagine the smoky haze of a hearth filled with cast iron pots, spit roasts, and a confusing array of implements, some recognizable, some baffling. you trace the rough edge of a wooden chopping block, scarred from years of cleaving bones and chopping roots. Knives were less standardized than today, often handmade by local smiths and varying wildly in size and sharpness. The occasional dull blade meant more effort and less precision in food prep. Roasting meat was done on a large spit, turned by hand, or a simple mechanical turn-spit dog, a small canine trained to run in a wheel that rotated the spit slowly. You can picture the little dog trotting away, blissfully unaware of its culinary contribution, its tail wagging beneath the roasting beast. A quirky tidbit: some kitchens used mortar and pestle combinations made from stone or bronze to grind spices and herbs, producing aromatic blends that could transform simple stews into exotic feasts. Historians still argue whether these blends were common or reserved for nobility. Fire was unpredictable, sometimes too hot, sometimes too cold. Medieval cooks often juggled multiple pots over open flames or coals, using clever hacks like lifting pots to reduce heat or burying food in ashes to slow cooking. Baking was another challenge. Most villages had communal ovens, large stone structures, where people took their dough to be baked in turn. This meant timing was everything. Too early or too late could mean cold or burnt bread. You might smile at the idea of cooks using rudimentary thermometers of their own design, judging doneness by smell, feel, or how the meat sang as it roasted. These sensory skills were honed over years, forming an oral tradition of cooking passed down carefully. Medieval kitchens were also loud, smoky, and chaotic, with shouting servants, clanging pots, and the occasional crash of a dropped utensil, quite different from today's quiet, climate-controlled spaces. As the fire crackles and warmth seeps into your skin, you appreciate the gritty, hands-on nature of medieval cooking, a blend of skill, patience, and a touch of luck. You ease deeper into the quiet night, and your mind drifts toward the social rituals surrounding food in medieval times, a world where meals were as much about hierarchy and ceremony as about nourishment. Picture a grand hall filled with long wooden tables, flickering candles, and a murmur of voices, the stage for dining as a social performance. At the top sat the lord and his family, their plates often piled with the choicest cuts and most elaborately spiced dishes. You might notice how servants carefully carved meat tableside, a demonstration of status as much as practicality. Common folk ate simpler fare, stews, coarse bread, and whatever vegetables the season provided. Meals were communal, often shared from large bowls or platters, reinforcing social bonds but also spreading the risks of the unwashed hands we talked about earlier. A quirky detail: some noble banquets featured entremet, theatrical dishes presented between courses, sometimes in the form of sugar sculptures, sometimes even live animals released into the hall for entertainment. Historians still argue how often these elaborate displays actually occurred versus being exaggerated by chroniclers. Dining etiquette was another layer of medieval food culture. While modern table manners were absent, there were rules, like the proper way to dip bread into sauces or the importance of keeping your fingers clean enough to eat without offending. You might chuckle to learn that in some circles, burping after a meal was considered a compliment to the chef, a sign that the guest enjoyed the food enough to make their satisfaction audible. Food also played a role in religious observances, with fasting days limiting what could be eaten and when. Fish, for example, was eaten on many fast days, which explains why it appears so often in medieval cookbooks. Even the timing of meals followed a daily rhythm. Breakfast was light or skipped altogether. Dinner was the main meal in the early afternoon, and supper was a smaller evening repast. As the fire dies down in your imagined great hall and the last candle flickers, you sense how medieval meals were about connection, status, and ritual, a world quite different from today's grab and go but equally rich in meaning. You breathe slowly, feeling the gentle weight of history settle around you. As your thoughts drift toward the close of this medieval journey, you find yourself reflecting on how the echoes of these old foodways still ripple in our modern world, often in the most unexpected ways. The quirks and challenges of medieval cuisine may feel distant, yet they shape traditions, tastes, and even farming practices that persist today. You might imagine the humble potato's introduction centuries later, transforming diets worldwide. But it was the medieval staples, grains, legumes, and preserved foods that laid the foundation for sustenance through hard times. The preserved foods, like salted meats and dried fruits, still conjure up images of storage cellars filled with the scent of smoke and earth. A quirky fact to ponder: some medieval recipes, rediscovered in dusty manuscripts, have inspired chefs today to recreate dishes with their peculiar textures and flavors, bridging centuries through taste. Historians still argue how accurate these recreations truly are, given the evolution of ingredients and cooking methods. The reliance on seasonality and preservation meant medieval people lived very much in tune with nature's rhythms, a lesson modern, fast-paced living sometimes forgets. And despite the challenges, medieval food culture was rich with innovation, community, and resilience. You might smile to think that the very suckiness of medieval food, as frustrating as it sounds, also inspired creativity, from pickling to fermenting, spicing to sugar sculpting, a culinary dance to make the best of limited resources. As you close your eyes, the scent of warm bread, spiced wine, and honeyed cakes lingers softly in the air, a gentle reminder that even the humblest meals carry stories and history. Now, dim the lights a little more, maybe shift into a more comfortable position, and let the quiet rhythms of medieval kitchens and feasts lull you deeper into rest. Sleep well, knowing that long ago, others like you found comfort, even in less than perfect food. The day's adventures in medieval kitchens and dining halls slowly fade, the vivid scents and sounds softening into a gentle, steady hum. Imagine yourself reclining comfortably, the warmth of the hearth replaced by the quiet stillness of your room. Your breathing eases into a calm rhythm, as if carried along by the slow, deliberate pace of medieval cooks tending their fires and turning their spits. The flicker of candlelight dims in your mind's eye, and with it the bustling noise of crowded halls and clattering pots falls away. You feel the cool night air brushing softly, carrying the faint scent of honey and fresh bread on the breeze. It's a peaceful scent, familiar yet distant, like a lullaby whispered through time. There's no hurry here, no urgency, only the slow unfolding of stories, like the gentle stirring of a pot simmering quietly. Let your thoughts wander lazily through centuries past, where people found ways to create warmth and comfort from simple ingredients, in kitchens where light danced on wooden beams and laughter echoed softly. You may never crave those medieval meals, but you can appreciate the human spirit that turned humble grains and odd spices into shared moments of rest and joy. Now, your own rest is near, and that same quiet magic settles over you, wrapping you in calm. So breathe deeply, let your muscles relax, and allow the peaceful past to carry you towards sleep's gentle embrace.